The leader took the first step forward, his pride more deeply wounded than his ribs, his face contorted with rage. But behind that fury, a truth he couldn't mask: fear. "You think you can hit me and walk away?" he growled, his voice cracking at the edges. Don Marino's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the night air like a razor's edge. "You'll what? Tell another joke about a girl who's worked harder in a day than you've worked in your whole miserable life?" The words landed with more force than any punch could have. The man wavered, his jaw clenching, his chest heaving, but his pride kept him shackled to his own stupidity. So he threw a punch. Don Marino didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He stepped right in. The fist barely moved through the air before Don Marino's elbow slammed into the man's jaw. A battering ram made of bone and muscle. The sickening crack echoed through the alley. The leader's legs gave way, his body collapsing like a marionette with its strings severed. The other three stood frozen, their bravado draining out of them like air hissing from a punctured tire. Then instinct took control. The first thug charged from the left, telegraphing his punch like an amateur. Don Marino caught his wrist in midair with the ease of a man picking fruit from a tree. With one swift, brutal twist, he wrenched the arm sideways, slamming the man's face into the brick wall, his teeth shattering against the unforgiving concrete. The body slid down the wall with a wet groan, leaving a bloody smear in its wake. The second one came in wild, his foot snapping upward in a clumsy kick aimed at Don Marino's ribs. Don Marino caught the ankle mid-strike, his grip like a vice. With a sharp yank, gravity took over. The thug hit the ground flat on his back, the air exploding from his lungs in one pitiful gasp. The last one hesitated, just a heartbeat too long. That was all the invitation Don Marino needed. Don Marino's fist plunged into his gut, folding the man forward like a cheap paper doll. A knee followed instantly, smashing upward into his chin with bone-jarring precision. His body flew back against the wall, slumping down beside his broken comrades. 10 seconds. That's all it had taken. For men had swaggered into the alley, arrogance pumping through their veins. Now, for men lay scattered like discarded trash bags, waiting for the garbage truck. Don Marino stood over them, his breathing even, his suit barely ruffled. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve as if violence were nothing more than another item crossed off his to-do list. The leader tried to crawl away, dragging himself toward the alley's mouth, his gold watch scraping against the rough pavement. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one punctuated by pain. Behind him, Don Marino's polished shoes echoed in steady pursuit. Not hurried, not loud, just inevitable. The bell above the diner door jingled again as Don Marino stepped back inside. The atmosphere had changed, heavier, yet quieter. The obnoxious laughter that had poisoned the air was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against the walls. Hannah was still working, her hands trembling slightly as she balanced a tray loaded with steaming coffee cups. Her eyes flicked past Don Marino to the empty booth where the 4 suits had been sitting, their arrogance lingering like the smell of smoke after a fire. "They gone?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Don Marino nodded once. "They're gone." Relief flooded her face, relaxing her shoulders, releasing the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But beneath the relief, something else flickered, something harder to define. Gratitude. A kind of gratitude that ran deeper than words. "Why'd you do it?" she asked softly, her voice steady now, her eyes searching his as if trying to find an answer she could believe. Don Marino paused. For a moment, his face remained unreadable, as if carved from stone. Then he shrugged, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. "Because no one else did." He placed a folded stack of bills on the counter, far more than enough to cover his meal, and turned toward the door. "Thank you," Hannah called after him, her voice firmer this time, carrying a newfound weight. Don Marino glanced back over his shoulder, just long enough for the faintest flicker of a smile to crease his otherwise cold expression. A ghost of warmth in an ocean of steel. And then he was gone, swallowed by the night, his footsteps fading into the city's constant hum. But the story didn't end there. By morning, word had spread, not just through the diner, but throughout the entire neighborhood. People talked. Whispers carried the tale of the waitress with one arm who wasn't invisible anymore, and of the 4 men who had mocked her but would never show their faces there again. As for Don Marino, he became exactly what he wanted to be. A ghost. A shadow who appeared, rewrote the night, and vanished before anyone could ask for more. Because Don Marino never sought applause. He wasn't there for the credit. He was there for the silence. And that night, the only thing louder than the bullies' laughter was how quiet they became when it stopped. The leader forced a laugh, loud and shaky, desperately trying to conceal the crack in his confidence. "What? You think you're some kind of hero?" Don Marino tilted his head, his dark eyes fixing on the man like iron. His voice dropped lower, softer, but sharper than a razor. "No," he said. "Heroes give warnings. I don't." The ensuing silence was heavier than any punch. The leader shifted in his seat, his bravado warring with the unease crawling up his spine. He shoved his chair back, rising to his full height, puffing out his chest like a man trying to convince himself he wasn't afraid. "You don't know who you're messing with," he snapped, his words more bark than bite. Don Marino stepped closer, the shadows of the diner clinging to his shoulders as if the night itself was taking his side. His voice was pure ice. "Neither do you." For a heartbeat, the diner froze. Hannah clutched a tray in trembling hands. The truckers stared, wide-eyed. The neon sign outside buzzed erratically, flickering like a faulty heartbeat. And then the leader made his mistake. He smirked, a mask of false courage, and shoved Don Marino in the chest. It wasn't even a forceful push, more of an insult than an effort. But it was enough. Don Marino didn't budge, not even an inch. He looked down at the hand pressed against his suit, then back at the man. His expression remained unchanged. Then, in a blur, faster than the eye could follow, his fist shot forward, a hammer wrapped in flesh. It connected with the leader's gut with bone-crushing force, doubling him over instantly. The man staggered backward into the booth, gasping, his gold watch clattering against the table as he choked on the pain. The diner fell deathly silent. Don Marino straightened the lapel of his jacket with the same calm precision he had displayed while stirring his coffee. His voice, when it came, was soft, controlled, deadly. "That's lesson 1. The other 3 froze in place, their bodies tensed, torn between the urge to fight and the instinct to flee. But when Don Marino's eyes locked onto each of them in turn, dark, unblinking, merciless, they didn't move. Finally, he spoke again. "Sit down." And to their own surprise, they obeyed. Hannah's lip trembled as she stood frozen with the tray in her hand. She wasn't used to anyone intervening. Not customers, not coworkers, not managers, and certainly not strangers. Most nights, she endured it all alone. The jokes, the stares, the laughter. It was easier to pretend she didn't hear, to keep her head down and push through the shift, just as she always had. But tonight was different. Don Marino met her gaze. Just a fleeting glance, subtle but enough. A silent message etched in the weight of his eyes. "You're not alone anymore." Hannah's breath hitched in her throat. For a moment, she didn't know whether to thank him or fear him. She set the tray down, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly, and whispered the only words she could muster. "Thank you." Don Marino gave the faintest nod. Nothing more. No smile, no comforting gesture, just acknowledgement. A recognition of her dignity that no one else in the room had bothered to offer. He turned away without lingering, walking back to his booth. He sat down with the same deliberate calm he had shown when standing up, his hand wrapping once more around his coffee cup, and lifted it to his lips as though nothing had transpired. To the rest of the diner, the scene was surreal. One moment, the room had been filled with laughter and mockery. The next, it was suffocatingly quiet. Even the hum of the neon sign seemed distant. The 4 suits slumped in their booth now, no longer predators, but prey. No longer hyenas, but dogs with their tails tucked between their legs. The truckers and night shift workers watched in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the man sipping coffee and the men he had silenced with a single blow. But Don Marino knew something they didn't. This wasn't over. Not yet. Because humiliation burns hotter than whiskey, and men like that rarely swallow it. They choke on it, and when they came back for a second round, he would be waiting. When Don Marino finally rose from his booth and placed a folded bill beneath his plate, the room still hadn't found its voice. The suits kept their heads lowered, whispering amongst themselves like cowards nursing their bruised egos. But their eyes, burning with humiliation, followed him as he walked toward the door. The bell above the diner jingled softly as he stepped out into the night. The city greeted him with its usual cacophony. Distant sirens wailing, a subway rumbling beneath cracked pavement, the faint growl of an engine turning over somewhere down the block. Don Marino's polished shoes struck the sidewalk with a steady rhythm, each step a metronome of control. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, his gold signet ring glinting under the flickering street light. To anyone watching, he might have seemed like a man heading home after a late meal. To those who truly understood, every movement was a warning. Behind him, the door jingled again. The sound of laughter returned. Only now it was quieter, uglier. The kind of laughter that dripped venom when it thought no one else was listening. Don Marino didn't turn. Not yet. He continued walking, his steps leading him deliberately toward the alley beside the diner. A narrow stretch of darkness lit only by a street lamp that couldn't decide if it wanted to stay alive or die. He entered it like a man choosing his stage. Sure enough, the footsteps followed. For pairs. Too loud to be careful. Too cocky to hide. "Oi!" the leader called out. His voice strained from the punch still lodged in his ribs. "Where you think you're going, tough guy?" Don Marino stopped slowly. The shadows wrapped around him, obscuring most of his face. Only his eyes caught the faint glow of the flickering lamp, glinting like embers, ready to ignite. When he finally turned, his voice was calm, almost amused. "I was hoping you'd ask." The four spread out across the mouth of the alley, blocking the exit, their silhouettes jagged against the weak light. They weren't laughing now. Not really. They were sneering, trying to regain control, desperate to convince themselves they weren't already in over their heads. "You embarrassed us in there?" One spat, his fists clenched at his sides. Don Marino tilted his head, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. "No," he replied softly. "You embarrassed yourselves. I just pointed it out." The diner was the kind of place you forgot 5 minutes after leaving. Cracked vinyl booths with stuffing poking out from the seams. A neon sign buzzing faintly, as if clinging to life by a thread. Grease hung heavy in the air, ingrained in every stool cushion and curtain, as if the place itself had long ago surrendered to it. It was late, past midnight, that hour when the city feels like it's running on fumes. The crowd was sparse. Just a few truckers nursing lukewarm coffee, a couple of night shift workers too weary to care, and those 4 suits who believed the world revolved around them. Don Marino sat with his back to the wall. Always with his back to the wall, a habit etched into his bones from a life where turning your back was never an option. His order was simple. Black coffee, bacon, eggs over easy. Nothing extravagant, nothing to attract attention. But the very simplicity spoke volumes. He wasn't there for company. He wasn't there to be noticed. He wasn't there for the food. And yet, the boisterous voices 3 booths down made anonymity impossible. He stirred his coffee slowly, his dark eyes lifting just enough to scan the room. To anyone else, it might have seemed casual, but Don Marino never did casual. Every glance was a calculation. Every silence a decision. The suits didn't realize it yet, but the atmosphere in the diner had already shifted. The waitress, Hannah, according to the faded name tag pinned to her uniform, moved with practiced efficiency. Quick, precise, balancing trays, pouring coffee, sliding plates across the counter with the grace of someone who had no choice but to be better, faster, stronger than everyone else. But her missing arm was the only thing the suits seemed to notice. "Hey, sweetheart." One of them jeered, slamming his empty mug on the table so hard it rattled. "How do you clap when the band plays, huh?" The others roared with laughter, the sound sharp and hollow, as if the cruelty itself were the punchline. Another leaned forward, smirking. Bet she gets a discount on gloves. The table erupted in laughter again, loud enough to make other customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. But no one said a word. That was the thing about men like these. They didn't need to be clever. They just needed to be louder than everyone else. A third one, trying to outdo the others, leaned over and shouted, "Careful. She might arm wrestle you and win." The joke landed heavily. Hannah's smile flickered for a moment, though she quickly plastered it back on her face like a mask she'd worn too many times before. In the corner, Don Marino's eyes flicked up from his plate. Just his eyes. His body remained still. Not yet. His jaw flexed once, twice. He placed his coffee cup back down with deliberate precision, as if every small gesture were part of a ritual only he understood. Hannah's hands trembled as she poured coffee, though she tried to hide it. She avoided eye contact with the suits the way someone avoids eye contact with a predator. Don Marino noticed everything. The bite of her lip when one of them accidentally dropped a fork on the floor, forcing her to bend down and pick it up while they snickered. The way her shoulders tensed each time they spoke her name as if it were a curse. His fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the table. Not impatience, but a rhythm, a signal, a decision slowly coalescing. The suits didn't realize it yet, but they had already crossed a line. And Don Marino was the kind of man who ensured that lines were never crossed twice. The ringleader, broad-shouldered, with slicked-back hair and a gold watch gleaming under the dim diner lights, leaned back in his seat, his arms stretched wide as if he owned the place. "Hey, Hannah," he called out, his grin dripping with malice. "Be honest, do you get half off at the nail salon, too?" The table exploded in cruel laughter, echoing across the diner. Their voices filled the silence, each cackle as sharp as shards of glass. And then, suddenly, the noise stopped, not because the suits had fallen silent, but because something else in the room demanded silence. The scrape of metal chair legs dragging across the linoleum floor, harsh, piercing, the kind of sound that cuts straight through the noise and into your bones. Don Marino had risen from his seat. He didn't rush. He didn't storm over. No. His movements were measured, heavy, each step echoing in the room like a slow countdown. The diner itself seemed to hold its breath. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Forks hovered above plates. Even the neon sign outside seemed to buzz more quietly. The four men looked up at him, their smug grins faltering slightly as he approached. The leader sneered, forcing bravado into his voice. "What's this? You her bodyguard now?" Don Marino stopped at their booth, his expression carved from stone, his eyes dark, unreadable, carrying the burden of a man who had seen too much and forgotten nothing. When he spoke, his voice was low, calm, dangerous. "She's doing her job," he said. "You should try doing yours." The men blinked in confusion. One of them snorted nervously. "Our job," he repeated. Don Marino leaned closer, his presence bearing down on them like a shadow too heavy to escape. "Yeah," he murmured. "Shutting up before I teach you manners." The words hung in the air like smoke. And for the first time that night, the suits had no joke. Some men mistake a diner for a circus. They don't order food. They order attention. They don't walk in hungry. They walk in thirsty for the kind of cruelty that inflates their fragile egos more than any meal ever could. That night, for clowns in button-down shirts decided their main act would be mocking the waitress. Not for the coffee she poured, not for the service she provided, but for the arm she was missing. They laughed like hyenas, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Their voices bounced off the walls, sharp, ugly echoes that scraped across the neon-lit silence. She kept her head down, as she'd been forced to do countless times before, carrying plates with the grace of someone who had long since learned to work twice as hard with half as much. To them, she was a joke, a target, something broken they could point at to feel whole for a few minutes. But to Don Marino, sitting quietly in the corner booth, she was about to become the reason four men would learn the bitter taste of regret served piping hot. Because bullies always assume they're writing the script until Don Marino decides to take the pen and rewrite the ending himself.